Hi, I'm Richard Lowe with the Leaders and Their Stories podcast. I'm the writing king and ghostwriting guru, and I'm here with Norman Kromberg, who is a security person who's got years and years and years of experience. Norman, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I'd be happy to, Richard. As you can see, my background, I have a jersey from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. I actually graduated from the university there, grew up in Lincoln, now live in Omaha, Nebraska. I've been described as a unicorn in the cybersecurity, information security industry. Why am I a unicorn? Because I started out as a business major in college, went into banking. I leveraged that background in business to move into technology. I did that by being a commissioned national bank examiner with the comptroller of the currency. After spending some time there, some of the smallest banks in the United States to a couple of the largest, being B of A, Citibank, I started to be a leader in technology audit at financial institutions, credit card processors, IT services company. That was on a global scale. From there, I was asked to start helping companies with a little thing called Sarbanes-Oxley in 2004, 2005. Firms really needed help rationalizing technology controls relative to financial statements. I parlayed that into roles in QA, roles in security, especially at telecommunications companies, payment companies, IT service companies, and even retail and distribution. Today, I'm acting as the Chief Information Security Officer on a fractional level for several companies, along with doing strategy assessments and serving on a couple advisory boards.
That sounds like a very interesting career. What would you say was the highlight of that career?
Well, the highlight, as I think back, and you asked for highlights, and I like to reference it's like picking your which child is the best or which pet is the best, and you can never really do that. But as I think back, the role I got the most reward at, or think about when you make a question like that, is when I was the Chief Information Security Officer at Southern Carlson. That's a retail and distribution company that specialized in light construction equipment. Our clients were contractors, so business to business relationship. And I was brought in to build a security program from scratch, partnered with the CEO, the CFO, the CIO, and most of the organization at the C level to build a program from scratch. Our goal was to build a program that enabled the company to get sold within 3 years. We actually did it in 2 years. What was rewarding about it, we weren't audited or regulated. So we were able to make decisions based on business factors, on needs of the business. What we've surmised is for every dollar we spent in security, we believe we added over $100 of value to the company, which helped for that sale. And that was pretty rewarding. And, high tolerance of risk. We were able to do that because our customers were in the permit offices of local municipalities. We didn't have intellectual property. Our prices were predominantly on the internet. Our locations were stores, and our people went out to the construction site. So it was really tied to what was needed to sustain the business. So that was probably the most rewarding from that standpoint.
Interesting. Yeah, I worked at Trader Joe's as the director of computer operations, and I had to deal with cybersecurity. We did the PCI compliance and a few other things, and PCI compliance is a bit of a pain, especially the first one. Oh my Lord.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you caught, I was in credit card processing with companies like First Data, ACI, and intimately affiliated with PCI. As a matter of fact, even prior to that, when it was the Cardholder Information Security Program under Visa, because each agency or group had their own standards, and PCI was the role of those merging from Amex, Discover, Visa, MasterCard. So I could go for hours on PCI if you'd like, Richard.
No, that's okay.
My sense is it's all painful for you.
That's okay. People will fall asleep anyway. PCI,
Exactly.
by the way, for our listeners, is credit card compliance, so that you make sure that as your credit card goes through, wherever it goes, that there's not at risk and that
Exactly.
hackers can't steal it and stuff like that. It's very important, and it covers things from do you have locks on the doors of your computer room to the encryption used between systems and things. It covers everything. It's very, very intensive, and it changes all the time.
Yes. As you need to. I would actually say, though, from my standpoint, if I look at it over the last 20 some years, I think it achieved what it was intended to. Let's face it, some of the most protected transactions are those credit card ones now.
Indeed. Yeah, in fact, some of the people who are breached, if they use similar type guidelines, they probably wouldn't have been breached, or at least it would have been less.
Yep. The impact is reduced quite a bit by what PCI has done, both on the merchant side and the bank side.
Yep. And I also did a bit of with NIST 853, which is a different standard for security, and that one's even more of a pain. And I documented things. I helped make up the procedures and documented things so that the policy might say you have to segregate duties, which means the CFO can't create the checks and then okay the checks, because that would obviously be a conflict. And I had so much trouble convincing the CFO that he couldn't do that. So I was in charge of setting up the rules for everybody and what they could and couldn't do and how they could do it and the procedures and things. Talk about interesting. I mean, on one hand, it was boring as watching paint dry. And on the other hand, it was kind of interesting talking to these people and trying to get them to comply. Well, we'll just pretend to comply. Some, they might say, or I'm the CFO. I can do anything I want.
Yeah. And I find that fascinating because it's almost how you have to lead organizations through change. I mean, it's explaining the why and what the options are. And PCI was a great example of that. We even still deal with it today. I mean, we could go through, again, the alphabet soup of all the things that make up security today. But one of the current ones is CMMC. It's the federal standard that they're holding their vendors and partners to. And it's much like PCI, very broad and not necessarily directive as much as that communicating intention. And it says, okay, how are you going to adapt to put in policy against that, procedure against it, standards against it? So,
is that the one that's known as FedRAMP?
FedRAMP was there, and then CMMC is the next evolution of it, if you will.
Okay.
So closely related.
I heard a lot of cursing in relation to that one from my friends who were in that area. Apparently, it's pretty strict.
Yeah, and FedRAMP may be replaced by CMMC. There's going to be a lot of cussing around that one too. I've worked with a couple clients already on it, and it's an evolution, much like you were describing with your story on the CFO.
So for our listeners, they have a problem they may not even know or understand at this point. The problem is there are hackers out there. And now there are a lot of nation state supported hackers where like Iran or Russia or China might support hacking to cause infrastructure damage. This raises the stakes. It's not just a breach anymore. It's a breach that could cause more concerns like a dam not working or electricity going out. Or I think Ukraine had a bunch of attacks on their infrastructure way before the invasion, where their electrical system was damaged for a little while, not destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
How do you protect against nation state stuff? I mean, what was the one that was in the Middle East? Stuxnet was actually a U.S.-Israel based one. And it was so cleverly written that it was called an air gap. It went across the air gap. There was no connection to the internet. So it still got to the systems. How do you protect against that kind of stuff?
Well, first off, I don't think you can protect against everything. There is no silver bullet. You can't do 100%. That's one of the challenges we face is, we're trying to chase something that's always evolving and changing. One of the comparisons I use, Richard, is, part of the security world has to come to the realization it's much like a tornado or the fires in LA or a hurricane or even a boat hitting a bridge in the Baltimore Harbor. Things happen. So some of this is how do you respond and detect what's happened? But also as part of having that conversation, I go back to some of the examples over my career. We would sit down and have the conversation, talk about what we were exposed to. So the example you just gave was nation state. Let's face it, not every organization has an impact on the critical infrastructure. So it's understanding where those threat vectors come from and what you're facing. We just talked about credit cards and the PCI one. Well, that's financial institutions. My example with where I was the CISO and we added value, quite frankly, we're a level 4 merchant. Credit card transactions were lower on our risk profile. So I think part of protecting it is knowing what your threat vector is, what your risk profile is, what's at risk. And I usually look to 4 different categories. First of all, let's face it, we have amateurs, people out there who are trying to do things. They think they read something on the internet, they're going to try it. Pretty easy to protect against, but creates nuisance.
Like in the movie War Games, an older movie, but blatant amateur breaking in accidentally.
Exactly. So very rarely are they as successful as in that one, but you're right. It's those kids, I call them script kiddies. They just play, they're trying. Hey, we have to defend against it. The second one I look to is nation state. Critical infrastructure, terrorism sometimes plays into that threat vector too. And those are hard to because it's an emotional motivation. Let's face it, they're going after something that's not monetary or you can't tie a value to because it's on an emotional one. The next one is I look at intellectual property theft, designs of say fire suppression, SIP designs, things like that where you can get an advantage business plans. Generally that threat vector comes out of places like China, North Korea. They're looking for a business advantage, if you will. Then finally, the one I have to deal with most of the time is just flat out criminals, organized crime. And Richard, their motive is pretty easy to understand. They want money, their profit motive. But it's helpful to understand that because part of what they do is they're not going to spend $1 billion to go through an expensive computer system to decrypt a line or a file. They're going to go through the path of least resistance, which is the human factor in most cases. So a lot of the issues we deal with is the human side. Hey, somebody accidentally clicks on a link, shares their password and ID, you've just opened the door. So much to your example before, it's much easier to go through the human side than it is investing billions. And that criminal side, they're very good business people. income minus expense equals net profit. They're going to minimize the expense side the best they can. So I found that helps explaining that when you ask the one about nation state, putting it in context. Now I've worked with municipalities and water companies and things like that, so we've had to address those exposures of compromising the water supply. So it just has to come into that context. Is what I tend to look at.
Yeah. Yeah. I was actually reading about the water supply, and it's actually really, really difficult to compromise because chemicals tend to disperse very quickly.
Yeah.
So dumping a bunch of chemicals or viruses in the water supply doesn't do as much as you'd think it'd do. There's a famous example of a terrorist in Japan who dumped tons and tons, I think thousands of tons of chemicals in the subways. Nobody even really knew because it dispersed.
Yeah. Well, I was going to jump in there and say also what we have to do is say what is information and cybersecurity versus overall security. Some of what you're describing with the water facilities is physical security. Now we account for that in a lot of our programs, but it's the physical perimeter too, along with the logical and cyber-based ones. And that's sometimes how we have to describe this too, is what's that primary boundary we're working to protect.
And it gets even more hairy when you start talking about networking and the internet, because then you got remote stuff to protect as well. And every one of those remote stations, whether it's human or AI or a machine or a sensor, is a vector.
Exactly.
And IoT is famously not well protected. IoT is the Internet of Things. It's your smart bulbs and your smart alarms and cars and things like that. Thermostats. Yeah.
Alexa devices.
Well, pacemakers actually falls under the medical Internet of Things. Yeah. But imagine somebody getting control of a pacemaker of, say, the president of the United States. That would be a problem. That would be a problem.
Well, and holding it hostage, we've had ransomware. I hadn't thought about it. That's a great example of, do you start using your ransomware techniques on medical devices and holding people that way versus the data side? Interesting vector. I'm going to borrow that one, Richard. I like that.
Yeah, we should write a science fiction book together on it,
That would be fun.
Nobody steal that idea. It's ours.
It's copyrighted now. I actually, though, like what you referenced there, because one thing I've been describing a lot with people in the assessments I do is, and this plays into cloud too. You didn't mention cloud, but as people have gotten out of physical data centers more into AWS, Azure, GCP, however you would define that. I am now saying the primary perimeter of an organization is defined by the identity, not by a physical boundary or wall. And that plays into your point on remote and AI and all this. So you have to think on a different perspective. It's that identity or that movement of data, not a physical boundary.
I was reading during the pandemic that Capital One has a great case study. They moved like hundreds of thousands of people to remote in a matter of weeks. They were ready for it and they had a plan. And part of that involves security. How do you secure hundreds of thousands of people who aren't necessarily experienced people with computers? How do you keep those people secure? It was a big problem, and they figured it out. They figured out something. I didn't really get into it, but you can put vert shells around their system or all kinds of stuff to make it secure. But still, 100,000 people remote going into the same cloud structure is a lot of people, a lot of vectors.
Well, and it's actually pretty easy to protect, but you also put it in the risk category. But probably the bigger issue they faced was just the change. Let's face it, one day you are all in the office building. The next day, as you pointed out, thousands of, if not hundreds of thousands of people in a different location. You have to change your monitoring, how you look at it, what you do to respond to incidences. So I think it's as much just the process around it. But it was interesting what you said there, that they had a plan for it, which tells me they had thought through scenarios and probably hadn't figured a pandemic of that nature, but enough of a foundation to be able to respond in a timely fashion. And they kept it secure because we didn't hear of anything. So they solved it or layered in things or evolved through it. I give them a lot of credit for being able to respond that way.
Yeah, I went to the disaster recovery seminar from the lady who was in charge of the computers that had the stock floor, and they were, of course, underneath the trade center before it collapsed. And she was in charge of the disaster recovery for that. And the law says the trade center cannot be down for more than a day. So that was the problem she had. And when the 9/11 happened, the trade center was not down for more than a day, even though it was under the building that collapsed. The stuff she was talking about, having to manage buses of people going from one place to another to the disaster site, and their hotel rooms and food, and because we're talking a lot of people, and all of a sudden, and it was amazing to hear her talk. I was in charge of disaster recovery at Trader Joe's, and just listening to that, I was like, yeah, that's a different order of magnitude of problem than I had.
I'm sure you've been an incident commander. having to run this, much like you're describing with her. I've done that on security incidences. And what's interesting that you didn't mention that I'm sure she had to deal with, that I think we need to pay attention to as leaders and dealing with these things, is the emotional side of things. Think about what those people were going through during 9/11. I mean, hey, you've got work issues and pressures, but you've got family, and especially in New York, just think of the instability and the chaos they were facing.
Yeah. Everybody was very emotional. We had a warehouse burn down, and we had to shift things around and ship from the West Coast to the East Coast instead of from the warehouse on the East Coast. And just that, the emotional level there, and being in an emergency and everybody working 18-hour days to keep it running and get the food there for people. Wow, that was big.
And I think as we're managing these, we have to pay attention to the team. I can recall one incident I was dealing with, and it was a Friday, and we're on the status call, and we've got technical teams raising things. We got people demanding things, and you could just see the tension, and it was increasing. It was tight. So as the commander of the incident, I just said, folks, we're taking the weekend off. I can see everybody needs some time away. So I said, everybody come back Monday, but go spend time with your family, relax, clear your minds. We can handle this. We're not at the time crunch. We have the ability to manage through this. Got to tell you, we sped up the process by doing that for the weekend. And I now use that to say, even on some instance, I look to say, can HR provide some counselors, some of that help to help us get through it as we do this?
Even bringing in pizzas for the troops can be good.
Oh, yeah.
We had an operations director who was in charge of the operations side. I was in charge of the computer operations side, and I'll give her a shout out. Her name was Lily Brum, and she we had that fire disaster, and we're all scrambling around. We're all going crazy, trying to figure out. Everybody's talking at once, and she got up and she just hit her shoe on the desk or something like that, and said, "Everybody, shut up! I'm in charge." And we all shut up, and she was in charge. Sometimes you got to do that. It worked. We got everything going the way we needed it to go to basically. How are we going to ship product there? Well, we've got a warehouse on the West Coast. It's going to cost us more, but that's better than having shelves empty and customers going over to a different store. And it was expensive, but we managed to do it, all because she said, everybody shut up. There were some senior people in that room, and they shut up too.
It's fascinating. 2 points there. One, what people need to realize in these instances, especially on the cyber side now, there's a nice little thing that's called insurance that can fund some of those expenses. And that's why you have it. I referenced the tornadoes, the hurricanes, the fires. So insurance is a player in this risk evaluation. The other one is understanding that you've got a bunch of alphas, and with her slamming the shoe and getting the attention, putting those people in place or managing them into the appropriate rooms or sub rooms on a system so you can manage the conversations. I've found that that's as powerful as, anything else you do, is just paying attention to the personalities and who people are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, somebody had to take charge, and all of us were trying to take charge at once, and she knew what she was doing. I mean, we're heading more into the risk area than the security area in this talk, but risk is a big part of security.
Oh, it is. Very much so.
What's your risk? I mean, one thing we didn't realize was the risk of those POS terminals, point of sale terminals, things where you put your credit cards through. Social engineering. People used to walk in and they looked like techs, and they'd have this POS terminal in their hand, and they replace them. They weren't our POS terminals.
Fake keypads over the top of them.
Well, these were actually
so when you're doing the PIN numbers, were they?
They put in whole new terminals, and those terminals were compromised. And fortunately, got caught on the first one because the guy was a bonehead, the hacker. I mean, they hired low-end people to do that part where they shouldn't have. Whoever was doing the hacking, but we were like, oh, this would have compromised the whole organization, and it was just a person who wasn't vetted at the store.
Well, you know what else is happening today? I'm sure you've seen this, but the use of first of all, started with emails, impersonating people. Now we get text message, and I think as we get all these chat systems with Slack and Teams and whatever you have out there, the amount of people that will impersonate a CFO, you mentioned the CFO before. Why did the CFO not cut checks? Because they are the ones authorizing. So you want to avoid millions of dollars going out on a single event. But that's the social engineering. That's my example of path of least resistance. Compromising the human with those things is so much easier to do.
One of the books that I wrote is called Cyber Heist for KnowBe4. It's a big company that deals with phishing. And I wrote the book that they give away for free. It's like 300 pages. And it talks all about these different spear phishing, which is a targeted attack against certain individuals, and CEO phishing, which is a targeted attack against the CEO, and so forth. These things are hard to spot, especially with AI and AI voices and things. You just gotta really use your brain and it's like, wait, why would he be ordering me to transfer $20 million today on a Saturday? And call him up.
You just highlighted one of the things that I have used and had back to my conversation with CFO CEOs. Some of the best defenses is just logic and reminding people of this. I go, are we ever going to do business on a Saturday or Sunday? And if our business cycle says stores are closed, offices are closed, we just don't do anything. And folks, you'll be fine. You don't have to move money. And if you're even questioning it, you'll be rewarded for asking me on Monday, not on Saturday. So just given awareness of the business processes and logical things like you just said, it makes no sense. Then don't do it.
It's like the bank always says, you get this call that says you should do this and this and this. You say fine, and you go to the website and you call the number yourself and ask them if that's really happening. And it's the same with the CEO or CFO. If you get a call that sounds just like the CEO that says transfer $40 million, because this actually happened in New Zealand, transfer $40 million, we'll call the CEO. Believe me, whether he's golfing or whether he's on vacation or whether whatever he's doing, he's going to thank you for that. He's either going to say, yeah, do it, or he's going to say, what? But you potentially save $40 million.
Which could be his bonus. I come back to some of the personal motivations. CEOs and CFOs really get compensated on the profitability of the company. Well, if you just wired out what would be the equivalent of the profit, guess what? A good part of their compensation went away. But you might appreciate this. One of the things I go back to is some of the fundamentals that I don't think necessarily change with all the advancement in technology. And I'm guessing, Richard, you'll remember this. Remember the old mainframes?
Oh, yeah.
IBM and those guys needed to do maintenance. They would call into the machine, through the modems and stuff. Well, every one of those mainframes properly configured, what they would do is disconnect and call back to the predefined number so you could do the maintenance.
That's how we defined it.
Yeah. But that's what you just described. It was call the CFO, call outside the current communication path to confirm it.
Now, even though that can be compromised if you have a man in the middle type thing, but still, it's much harder. It's much more difficult. Yes. I mean, you could have, a nasty or compromised switchboard operator, so to speak, or something in the middle that intercepts the call. But you're talking nation state level stuff at that point.
Yeah, we're back to those 4 threat vectors I mentioned, right? So I just went to one of the 4. Yeah. And it's also, I usually put in multi-layered defense in depth programs. That's kind of what we've been describing to a degree. So you have other layers that ideally mitigate that and all that. So for example, if the call came in from Algiers and you never do business in Algiers, a flag ought to go up too on top of the out of normal path stuff. So I look for those layers you can deploy and even get creative with, or back to some fundamental stuff that it may not make sense. So don't do it.
I wrote a book called Safe Computing is Like Safe Sex. If you don't practice it, it doesn't do you any good.
That's good.
It compares it to a castle. The way they used to build castles was a ring defense. So you'd have a moat, and then you'd have stakes, and then you'd have like big sticks in the ground, and then you might have the archers, and then you might have another moat. So if they get through one, they run into another one, and they're different. And that's the way the ideal defense works, is you have different types of security at different levels. And then you even have the deeper security inside, like maybe, the financial system that has all your data shuts down if it views a compromise. It can't do much if it's not getting no electricity.
Well, it's funny you say that. As I work with firms, one of the things I say is I can secure any company or organization in less than 30 minutes. Oh, yeah. Completely secure.
Turn it off, unplug it, put it in a hole in the ground.
The problem with that usually is you can't do any business and generate revenue. So that kind of upsets a few people, but we are secure. So that allows us then to back up and say, what's the right level? What kind of controls, to your point? Where do you pull hit the fire button that shuts everything down with Halon if you're in a data center, or that, crisis button that stops everything.
Yep. You mentioned cloud earlier. The thing to remember about cloud is you've got multiple levels of multiple vectors there, one of which is the telecommunications over the internet. That can be compromised if you don't have good security in place, encryption and things. So you could have your cloud compromised and not even know it. I don't know if it's happened yet, but it's certainly feasible.
I would contend it has happened. I think traffic's been diverted there. You could be in the middle. And what I think we have to pay attention to, and this is what, maybe I'm crazy and have to think different ways. I go, let's think about what we don't know or what could be happening. And sometimes they'll lay there for a year or two and just capturing data and information. So in your example there, they may be just monitoring and try to understand how your business operates. What are the key factors? And then act at a certain time. But you're right, because even then, if you move to the cloud from an internal system, you've now put some trust into a third party. It's AWS, it's Microsoft, it's Google. How much do you trust them? Where's that level of trust at?
And do you have audits? on the cloud side. I mean, you auditing the cloud system, how do you do that? If you're a small company, you probably can't. If you're a larger company like Bank of America, oh yeah, you can have audits. But it depends. Is Apple going to let you walk in and monitor and audit their AWS systems and make sure they're secure? Probably not. They'll give you a report, but who made that report? Do you trust who watches the watchers? That's an old Heinlein book, who watches the watchers? Heinlein's concept. Robert A. Heinlein's a science fiction author.
But verify plays into that, is I think what you're describing. Okay, I got trust here, but how do I verify that trust? That's where those audits, SOC 2 type 2 reports are big. But again, who performed it? Is it down here or here? It's back to what you mentioned on PCI. They had assessors come in. Well, those assessors had to be blessed by the PCI agency so that you had some integrity with what they were doing, and they had enforcement. So that all plays into those multiple layers and how you establish trust. So you're right on the cloud is who do you trust and how do you trust it?
And DNS is one of the most insecure things of all, even the more secure ones. It can be revectored any way you want with a command if you've got control of that DNS server. They've tightened it up a little bit, but the nature of the beast is it's very difficult to secure. Thank you, early internet people. Well, of course, IP6 is a little bit better, but
Yeah. But what's interesting though on that is as we evolve and the next generations come up, an interesting thing I find is, do they know how to make a phone call by hitting the digits? Because some of what you're describing is if you can't connect on the internet, how do you make a call on a different channel or protocol? And so much is driven by the internet. So your DNS things come into play, doesn't it? Because it's the backbone of a lot of what happens.
Yeah, back in 9/11, when the towers collapsed, the big problem was the Verizon switch was underneath the towers. There was no cell traffic, because there were no cell computers, at least not Verizon ones. So if your communication was cell, especially today, and most cell phones go over landlines anyway, they just go to a tower and then go to they're not all in the air. So
exactly,
you don't want to depend on that. In fact, landlines are usually more robust than cell towers.
Higher volume and have a lot more capacity. The interesting on 9/11, and we'll see this on certain events now, probably not to that degree, but just the volume shut down the network too. So for AT&T, Sprint, who was still around then, they all were not available because everybody's on the phone. They're trying to call loved ones. They're trying to get 9/11, emergency services in. They're coordinating things. Much to your example of recovering the trading floor, they're having to communicate, and they're using every means possible.
I imagine during the LA fires or the hurricanes, for example, communications went to heck. I was here in the hurricane. I got a direct hit from Milton. I didn't try the communications. The internet went down for 8 hours and it was back and everything was back. It was cool. Like, thank you. Thank you, Spectrum. Thank you, Duke. You did good. You're my buddies. We were only down 8 hours, but their neighborhood was down for 4 days. It turns out that Duke actually said, oh, there's a hurricane, and they shut off the power intentionally so that they just had to turn it back on rather than blow a bunch of transformers.
But that's back to the example you had with Capital One with the pandemic, having plans and what decisions you can make to minimize the impact, but also get back up and operational. So let's face it, hurricanes are common in Florida. My wife is from there. She spent 20 years in Jacksonville. It's amazing hearing her talk about how a hurricane's coming, what you do to prepare, you get things ready. I live in the Midwest. One of our most common ones is tornadoes. Not necessarily predictable like hurricanes, but the concentration of damage is so focused that we can work around it. The fires are an interesting one too, as it's randomly going through. What could be done to provide for recovery quicker?
Yeah. And it's all very interesting when you start thinking about just how big the United States is and how much infrastructure we have. I mean, it's in, the $500 trillion range of infrastructure. That's half $250 billion of infrastructure. Wow. And that's more than any other country in the world by far. And all of that stuff has vulnerabilities, and all that stuff has old stuff, pipes, water pipes that are decaying, that have been there 100 years, bridges that get hit that don't have pylons to protect them against a boat. You'd think they'd have something in front of it,
Yeah.
But, when they built them, they didn't think about it, or they didn't have the money for it.
You get into the cost. Well, and I was just going to say the cost benefit analysis. Back to the example I used when I was at Southern Carlson as a CISO. We're making decisions on what do you spend with the likelihood and the impact. And you're always doing that trade-off. So those pylons, how many times has a boat hit that bridge?
How many times has a container ship that's huge hit a bridge going that speed? That was probably the first time.
Yeah. I mean, I used to do this when I was an auditor and examiner. We talked, you mentioned disaster recovery, business continuity planning. We used to do audits on that. We'd ask questions on it from an examiner standpoint to challenge how well they're prepared. And I like to share the story now is prior to 9/11, if I'd gone into a senior level executive, a CEO, CFO, CIO, anybody at that level and said, let's talk about your disaster recovery. Here's the scenario. We got 4 planes hijacked. 2 of them have taken out the World Trade Center. One of them's hit the Pentagon, and there's another one we don't know about, but ends up in a field in Pennsylvania. Work the situation. Their first response was, that's not reasonable. That's never going to happen. Well, you mentioned it before with the container ship going too fast, hitting a bridge. It's that, their big container ship. First time it happens. Something always happens. Back to the Capital One, being prepared to at least have command, control, and make decisions. We can use these to help you prepared and at least manage the risk. So the impact is less. Might not change the likelihood, but the impact can be at least coordinated and managed.
There's a book that I've read 4 or 5 times. It's called Touching History, I think. And it's about the FAA's role in 9/11 and what they had to do. And it's like, wow, like there was no procedure, period. There were only 4 military jets in the Eastern Seaboard, period. They weren't armed. So that one in Pennsylvania, if they'd had to shoot it down, it was a ram. They were going to hit it. And they were going to. Can you imagine being the pilot and having to make that decision?
Well,
And
of the fighter jet of flying, because you're sacrificing your own life for it,
your
probably.
own life and all of the live passengers. Which is it a false alarm? Just and the FAA did the first and only shutdown of the entire United States. He didn't have that was the day he started his job. He started working there, and he had to shut down the entire U.S. airspace, and he didn't have the authority. He just said, do it.
Well, sometimes I'm trying to be an optimist, and I look at it this way. I'm pretty sure he never had a worse day than that for the rest of his career.
Probably not. Probably not. And then there was a movie I saw, a documentary about they had to divert, all these planes come over Greenland, and they come to the United States through Canada. They had to divert something like 300 planes into Canada. Emergency. Those airports weren't ready for that. And they picked up the slack. Talk about a disaster situation. They picked up the slack. They landed all the airplanes, no problems. Then they had to get food in and buses and all this other stuff. And wow.
There is a town, I think it might have been in Greenland or Iceland, a small airport that can handle the jets, but they took a lot of them. And the town just rolled out the red carpet, took care of passengers. And I've since learned that a lot of the passengers have gone back and they've had reunions because of the close relationships that were developed for people helping out.
That was exactly the town I'm talking about. I think it was in Canada,
Okay.
and in the upper area, like Nova Scotia type area. I'm not familiar with the area, but it was up there. Yeah, I think they landed 200 planes when they're like, how do you do that? when you get like 4 a day, at the most, and they did it. And they said, because we're Canadians, we're friends.
And it's amazing that what can happen in situations like that when you just start communicating and talking. And I give credit to the guy who said, let's bring down the whole system, because how else are you going to protect the population?
Yeah. Yeah, he just brought them all down. He did it was called A Ground Stop. It's amazing. It's an amazing book. I would highly recommend it. It's not really security related. It's more disaster related, but it goes over it from a point of view that I haven't heard before. What about all these people who control all those planes and the pilots? It talks about the pilots, how this pilot was told, turn right now, fast, do it. And they never do that. No, turn left, quick, steeper, go into stall, It's like, whoa, you're a pilot going, what the hell?
It's fascinating when you just said that about this isn't security, but what I like to use, and this helps with the challenge we have in security, because everybody goes, it's an expense. Let's face it. You are asking people to spend money for nothing to happen. But where can I use things that they're used to seeing or heard about that are outside just technical world that helps them understand? So if I have to do tabletop exercises, pulling in some of those things to help them come to an understanding of how their role is in this, or to think through it, or the ramifications. And let's face it, it's still incident response, it's risk management, it's likelihood, impact, decision making. And I look at those a lot as I go through and try to rationalize, where do you put in layers, what layers do you put, what do you invest in, or where do you just accept I'm taking the risk? I like your example. A huge container ship going too fast hits the bridge. How many times did that happen? Probably the first time. Okay, we can deal with what to do if we want to prevent it in the future, or how do we respond in the future? So
yeah. The irony there is, I think all the other pylons had the pylons in front, but that one didn't. But so it was just probably an oversight. But stuff happens, you know. I mean, the infrastructure is large. We've got hundreds of thousands of bridges.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. We've wandered all over the place on this discussion, but it's fun.
What I enjoy. I love wandering like that. It helps me stay sharp.
Yeah, but I think that what would you say the takeaway for our listeners is on security?
It depends on who's listening. So if you're a consumer, listen to what everybody's telling you. Simple things. It's fundamentals. Today, turn on multi-factor and alerting on every account you've got. While it may seem annoying, it stops things from happening.
It's more than annoying, but it's definitely helps.
Well, and since I'm in the industry, you know, I use 3 different authentication apps. I use the text messaging, I use emails, and I mix it up and I use complex passwords. So I listen to some of the guidance. But for the consumers, I'd say listen to that and use it. I know it's challenging, but at least it gives you a layer of protection. On the business side, what I'd say is have the conversation. One of my mentors taught me a long time ago about risk management, and I use this in security, is it's not necessarily the outcome, it's the process and the conversation, the discussions, talking like we've just done for the last hour. What are scenarios, things like that, thinking through it and then making the decision where you want to put those lines is powerful. So that's where I'd say is be patient, focus on fundamentals, and have a conversation.
Have a conversation. And the other thing I would say is learn to speak the language of your audience. So if your audience is C-levels and you're a CISO, don't talk CISO terms, talk C terms. So you're talking KPIs, you're talking risk, you're not talking wireless techniques and passwords and stuff to them. You're talking business. That was a mistake I made many times when I was younger.
Well, and I go back to what we started with when I said it was a unicorn, having been in banking, being a business major in college. You know, I tell people what messed me up working in banking is when I look at a balance sheet, loans are an asset, checking accounts are a liability. That's how banks operate. But I've actually used that to say, you talk to your point in the language of that industry and what those business people think of. And you try to learn it. That's where I said listening, have the conversation to put it in that context. And you're dead on. A CISO should be in the business side of the organization, understand what they face from the financial standpoint.
Yep. And when I ghostwrite books, because I'm a ghostwriter, what I do is write the book in the language of the audience. So if a CISO came to me, we wouldn't, unless it was a technical book, we wouldn't be talking in CISO terms. We'd be talking in C-level terms or whoever the audience is. And that's very, very important because otherwise your book is flop, doesn't achieve your goals. So
for sure. Well, one thing a mentor told me, I think plays into that as we close. Can you describe it as if you're talking to your grandmother or a kindergartner?
That works. That works. Break it down and use the terminology that they're used to. It would be the other thing. So if you're talking to a kindergarten, you're going to use kindergarten terms.
Exactly.
I had to write a children's book. That was one of the things I've done. And it was a young adult book and went through beta testing where they read it, beta reading and so forth. The only thing that they said was, this is really, really good. We love it, except we don't understand some of these words because I'm an adult. So I had to fix that. That was easy fix. But those things are lessons. Talk in the language of your audience. And that will help if you're in the security business, that alone will help you succeed even better.
Agreed.
Well said. Well, you've been on the Leaders and Their Stories podcast. This one was a bit long, but that's cool. I had an interesting conversation with an interesting guy. Where can we find you?
You can look for me on LinkedIn, Norman Kromberg, and that's the best place to find me.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I'm Richard Lowe. This is from The Writing King, and I'm the Ghostwriting Guru. And you can find me at thewritingking.com or ghostwriting.guru. And we've had a fascinating conversation about cybersecurity. And this podcast is generally daily. So, hunt down more episodes and have a good time. Thank you.